Comrades, you are welcome to this event, Identity, Culture, and Curriculum, the type of education that is needed in Britain. Good afternoon and greetings to each and everyone. This event provides you opportunities to get plugged in and be part of the change of the education system that has mainly served the privileged few elites. These few within the system are so much organized and have cleverly engineered the system to benefit them. Historically, our schools are set up to provide field workers that will keep the economy going, and the place are set up to protect the investments of the privileged few. It's no hidden matter. We all know of our school to prison pipeline, policies and procedures introduced in schools unfairly targeting children from Black and marginalized backgrounds, leading to more exclusions and eventually pushing children towards the criminal justice system. It has never been designed to make the majority to be economically and politically literate. The pandemic COVID-19 has done us field workers some good. In fact, the best thing that has ever happened in Britain. It has exposed the systematic inequalities in our system, where the richest 1% in the UK owns the same wealth as the bottom 80%, or 53.2 million people. When the whole of Britain was in lockdown, these essential workers still have to go to work, many of whom had to take public transport to work. The privileged few failed to provide PPE for such workers who were pushed to the front line. They failed to take into consideration the impact that such exposure will have on the health of the workers, their families, and financial status, as well as their personal lives. What was our ruling elite concerned about? The economy, and not how many people are dying or are being affected by the pandemic. Similarly, we have the judicial system that tends to be biased against Black boys and young men. It is not a hidden matter. The government website has the data of Black people, 16-year-olds and over, are being victims of crime. Highest rate in being sent to prison, highest rate of stop and search, etc. More information on this will be presented by one of our fantastic speakers today. The inner spirit is never enslaved. If you want to enslave a child, do not teach him or her about his or her forefathers. This is what the education system has been doing to Black children without their history and with negative images of Black people on our television screens and in the education system. I will illustrate this pictorially with the symbolic medal given since the colonial era. One of the people that will have won such medal as the gatekeeper protecting the interest of the colonial supremacists is the Minneapolis Police. Towards the end of the 19th century, the order was awarded to those who have performed distinguished services in the colonies and protectorates of the British Empire. And in more recent times, it has been widely used as an award to ambassadors, and senior diplomats from such countries, as well as colonial governors. You do not need to imagine. See who they represent. Look at the colors of the people in the medal, and look at the color of the placeman. Look at the one who was being reprimanded in the medal, and look at the one who is being reprimanded by the place. Using the slave terms, since our foreign secretary said that he only kneels for the queen and his wife, he could not be regarded as the house slave. He gets all the privilege and protects the interests of the wealthy people. Hence, he and his boss are sending the field slave and their children back to the plantations without PPE, and with some schools diluting the hand-washing liquids because of lack of money. Position. There is the field slave at the bottom of the house slave on the top. A slave is a slave. Both are expendable and are easily replaceable, as we saw in the Sajid Javid situation. Out goes one, in comes another. Their instruments of office, as you can see in the images, they were given chains and anchors as instruments of their office to perform their roles and to torture Black people. Weapon. The weapon that they use are maiming and killing the failed slave, hence a sword in one and a gun in the other, because they are gatekeepers and are always afraid of what the failed slaves will do to them. Outcomes. One appears to be succeeding, whilst the other is incarcerated or dead. The system of power is by design one that relies on destroying the mental state and the identity of the failed slave. More of indoctrination than education. The failed slaves are always propping up the system, as reflected in this image of a broken pot. Mr. and Mrs. COVID-19 virus that does not discriminate came and smashed it all. As we say in Yoruba, Kerigbe tofo, deyin leyin odo, which means you cannot take a broken calabash to the river because you will not come with anything. This event is not to push aside all this as if they are not happening, but one of reimagining what our education system should be. We cannot continue in a system that continues to benefit the few. One that terrorizes Black community and the white working class. We must reject a system that puts profit over people. We need to create a system that allows every child to have an education that unlocks for them the door of hope and gives them access to the wealth of our nation, providing them a true economic, political, and digital literacy. Post-COVID-19 has exposed the inequalities created by the old system, and we have come here today to say enough is enough. It has given us opportunity to cook a delicious meal, one which we invited you to come to and taste and participate in cooking more at your own school and across Britain. One that will build up individuals to develop the capacity to be in control of their own life. As we say in Yoruba, Ilé ọba tó jó, ẹwà ló bùkún. That is the palace of the king that has been destroyed. There will be beauty coming out from it because it's beauty from ashes. We have come together today to start to look at this. Our current system of education does not break the barrier for our children because it has been designed to create obstacles in their paths of progress. Thus, our work as educators is to break out of this constant circle of discussion, of asking and demanding a solution whenever a tragedy strikes, into setting up reviews and generating a report that the privileged oligarchy always learn from: Windrush, Greenfell, Black people and minority groups overrepresentation in COVID-19 deaths. The slogan in a parrot version coming from the White Hall with our Secretary of State and the Prime Minister has always been, "We have learned the lessons." Even sometimes before the reports have been published, revealing their indifference and apathy to the sufferings of the masses, especially our Black community and the working class, as long as they are getting their profits and collecting their dividends. What we put forward here is a creation of an alternative system of education that utilizes the language of the people, one that has its roots in the true culture of our communities. Our attention needs to be problem-solving focused on providing a framework to one that will retell the whole story and tell it as it is. Black history does not start on the day that Britons landed on the shores of other continents. Thus, we need to make the lives of other people visible when planning, documenting, delivering, assessing, and celebrating success of the contents of our curriculum. What I've said so far focuses on our system, a system that is designed to negate the life and experiences of Black people. It's not one that supports or encourages them to know where they are coming from. This event is to present an alternative, one that will holistically cater for every child, giving them what relates to them, using their language and experience, making them visible in every sense, and in a way, making them literate culturally, historically, economically, politically, educationally, and socially to take their place within the new system. I will draw on the past and current experiences of our Black community and Black educators. I will invite participants to be more than sit and screen warmers and become involved as game changers in their classrooms, schools, and communities. I will now call on the first speaker, Betty. Betty will focus on the curriculum, specifically on the history being taught in the primary sector, the need to retell some of our story, and how a network has been created to generate materials and distribute resources to schools. Present tips on how our story could be introduced to the curriculum. I present to you Betty Joseph.
All right, brilliant. Welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to join this discussion this afternoon. It's totally topical, considering what climate and what's going on, and everything that Sam has just relayed to you. I'm a primary school teacher of over 20 years experience, and my specialist subject is history. I've got a passion for making links and understanding the past, which is often relevant to the present. I'm very clear that Black history is not separate to world history. We are an integral part of it. We were there then, and we are here now. My dissertation question at university was, is Black history in schools tokenistic? Which stemmed from my concern about what was happening in schools. My research unearthed the lack of confidence teachers had in teaching it and the lack of available resources at that time for primary schools. Black history back then consisted of culture activities such as international evenings or food sharing and maybe even music, but not much history. That is not the case now in terms of resources, especially as we have YouTube, Instagram, all sorts of other internet search engines, a variety of books that are now available online, and places for research such as museums, the Public Record Library in Kew, the newspaper library in Colindale, and several other places. However, teacher confidence is still an issue. In my first school, although the head teacher was a tough character, she gave me the lead position of humanities and allowed me to provide Black history resources throughout the whole history curriculum, which was also linked to geography. Other subjects such as science and DT were included. And nowadays we've got loads of Black artists that people can use in schools. So when we were doing the Tudors, I found information about the Black Tudors. And there's a new resource out now by Miranda Kaufman. Can you see this? Yeah.
Yeah.
She shows evidence of Black people living free in Tudor England. I'll put the link on the chat box a bit later on. And there is also the John Blank Project, which looks at a Black Tudor trumpeter. Okay. Now, if it was Britain since the 1930s, they were provided with information on the world effort in World War II. Tanks were sent from Jamaica, food, money, oil, mineral, and several countries contributed, especially in terms of manpower. I helped Mark Wadsworth a few years ago promote his Divided by Race, United in War and Peace resource in Southwark, which documents our contributions in the form of a DVD. Last year in my Year 4 class, we learnt about Matthew Henson, an African-American man who was the first man to reach the North Pole in our non-fiction literacy lessons. I hadn't heard of him before, and it was a stark example of how racism plays a part in not including our contributions to the world. Mr. James Cook got all the credit, and it was only on his deathbed that he revealed the truth that it was actually Matthew Henson that reached the North Pole. And at the age of 70, Matthew Henson was given the acclaim he should have had, but of course, not the sensation that Mr. Cook received at the time. As educators, we need to challenge the status quo. I took my class to the Maritime Museum as part of that topic to experience the Polar Explorers exhibition. There was no mention of Matthew Henson, and my students were quite quick to point that out. So I spoke to the curator, who was doing short talks about the explorers, and I asked him where Matthew Henson was. He told me I should join the library by writing to them and work with them to get the necessary information. So I wrote to the museum expressing my concern and my wish to return and see him represented. I'm still waiting for a reply. I plan to return though in better times. Hidden Stories is another example of how pivotal our contribution to society and the world have been and still are. If it wasn't for contributions from Black women such as Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mae Jackson, and their crew, with their knowledge of maths and calculus, America would not have entered the space race when they did. Russia had got there first. And it took another 17 years to get the first Black astronaut, Captain Dwayne Dwight Jr., on the space program. Now, Blacks in Science books are also very, very good. to be used in your science lessons. They're ready-made, ready to go, absolutely brilliant. And they are made by BIS Education. And these are just a few examples of our story, how our story can be integrated into the national curriculum as it is. Previous campaigns have succeeded in getting Mary Seacole onto the Key Stage 1 curriculum, and secondary schools can now teach about the enslavement of African people. However, that cannot be complete without the history of Black people prior to that period and the links to the Industrial Revolution. It would also be good to do some research into the Spanish Inquisition to see where racism actually started. During my time as a national constituency seat holder for race on the national executive, one of my visions was to have regional networks set up to be able to represent the views and experiences of Black teachers around the country. And this was started in London with the formation of the London Black Teachers Network in 2014. A group of like-minded teachers who volunteered their time to keep Black teachers in the profession by signposting them to CPD opportunities and advice alongside producing and promoting Black history in schools. This was achieved by putting on yearly Black history events in Hamilton House, which was then the NUT headquarters, now NEU, where notable speakers in the field shared their knowledge and expertise through talks, workshops, and resources were bought for schools and personal use, because we always had stalls at each event. We've had MPs such as David Lammy, Dawn Butler, and others to support our events, alongside history specialists such as the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, Arthur Torrington from the Windrush Foundation, who has produced an excellent resource for Key Stage 2 children, and it's available with lesson plans now. My school is actually going to be starting to use that from Monday. London Black Teachers and the NUT endorsed his application to get the funding to produce these resources. This is one of his resources. It's a memorial to the Windrush campaigners. Robin Walker put together the Black History Timeline, and he contributed to the Black British History book, which also sold out at one of our events. You may well have seen these, you may have them in your household. These are all very good resources to have in school right now. We were pleased to note that last year, for the first time, the NEU sent Black resources to every school in England. The London network has had support over the years from a variety of specialists in the field, and any work on changing the curriculum should involve them. Current campaigns such as the Black Curriculum, Another World is Possible, alongside the Runnymede Trust and Decolonizing the Curriculum, all need to coordinate with each other and have one clear demand, which is the statutory inclusion of our story into the national curriculum. The next generation deserve to know the truth, which we have been denied. And with all our support, this will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. That was really useful, because sometimes we forget things that we've been taught. And here you are more or less giving us the ingredients that we're going to use in putting things together. Our second speaker is going to be Zahra Bey. She will be focusing on providing her 11 years experience in the pupils referral unit system and a closer examination of the nature of the curriculum improves the urgent need for an anti-racist curriculum with a critical and intersectional analysis of the inclusion and exclusion paradoxes in the PRO system, where social justice moves from being rhetoric to praxis.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. I'm so glad to be in this space. I want to say thank you to Sam for organizing and everybody else that's involved. organizing events like this takes a lot of time and thought. So those of you who don't know what it means to teach in a PRU or a pupil referral unit, it's a funny, hidden, dark space in education that, you know, if you work in mainstream, you may never visit. Many teachers may not even, you know, have any direct dealings with. I fell into PRU teaching almost by accident after 10 years in mainstream, in a secondary mainstream in North London. And I just simply wanted to, I was burnt out, to be honest, and I wanted to be closer to home, closer to my family. And I was beginning to become disillusioned, if I'm honest. I had the 7-year itch, and I thought, is this, you know, working my way up into middle leadership as a head of department, is this what, you know, I'm supposed to be doing? Is this my purpose? I was, you know, leaving. I remember my son at 7 in the morning and picking him up 7 at night, and I was deeply disillusioned with the career, with my career. Oh, my daughter's just walked in. Sina, you can't be here now. Okay, so what happened after that?
Mommy,
Yes.
look.
Oh my goodness. It's fine because it's fine. Sorry about this, everyone. There you go. So fell into PRU teaching, and I actually think that that's where I became a teacher. So what I wanted to offer to you today is something on identity that revolves around teacher identity in particular. And as someone who has been in education for 21 years now, half in mainstream and half in the PRU setting, and now I am out of the classroom, but working as a researcher and as an activist and obviously a parent, I had time to reflect and think about my practice and the contested terrain that is teacher identity. So I think we can't talk about identity, culture and curriculum if we're not willing, first of all, that to be vulnerable. I think that's really important as teachers. I think one of the things that has become clear to me over the years is that good teachers are relationship builders. They're people that can connect, that have that special something that that goes beyond just empathy and compassion. So that's really important. But I want to start with my positionality, because in the classroom, I actually think that is an exercise for all of us to do, not just sociologists and people that do social justice as a field of study, but all of us, I think, need to start with, particularly white educators, I have to say, but not exclusively, with considering doing some deep reflexivity work into, you know, what is my identity? Where do I sit? What's my positionality gifting me with? And white European heritage. I fall into what Zeus Leonardo calls a racially ambiguous category. And we know that more and more of our children in our classrooms, you know, and in society in general, people in society may feel they belong to that category. I mean, politically, I'm absolutely clear where I stand, but to the world, I present in particular ways. And that identity can be very visible in some spaces and can afford safety to me in some spaces, whereas I can become quite invisible in other spaces. So how does it all relate to the PRU? So going back to what I was saying about how did I become a teacher? How did my teacher identity form within the PRU? So the PRU in East London, where I taught, was a deeply racialized and classed environment where the majority of the children, and gendered, the majority of the children were boys, but not exclusively, because the girls, the numbers of girls are being excluded are rising. Majority were free school meals, probably about 3 out of 4. All were placed on the special educational needs and disability register on arrival, with or without consent or knowledge, which I wish I had more time to explore, but it's deeply problematic. And they were all Black, Asian, many were Muslim. The teaching body of the PRU, to an extent, did reflect the student body, but the management structure absolutely did not. In terms of the curriculum had a strong bias towards PSHE and SMSC and of late British values. It had tried to incorporate citizenship elements. A lot of it was driven bottom up at the Peru, not very much top down. And in general, I don't think discourses, conversation on identity and race were adequate, anywhere near adequate. So although I've left nearly 2 years now, I've kept in touch with people there, and I've got many colleagues who continue teaching Peru's, and the frustrations remain the same. You are operating your teaching in an environment that is deeply classed, deeply racialized, has contours that require a particular kind of vocabulary and understanding intersectionally, particularly talking about interlocking identities and axes of oppression that these children face, disadvantaged children face. And yet the teachers are not necessarily, I don't think, equipped. Teacher training is another big problem. There's a report that's just come out, published by the Running Meet earlier this week, exactly on this very subject. Teacher training, the curriculum, the representation within schools, it really dramatically has to change in this country. I mean, we are at crisis point. We are talking about a recovery curriculum and a catch-up plan, but really we would really need to consider where does race, class, gender, and disability fit within all of that. And I would say, in particular, the racial literacy that educators have or don't have right now really needs to shift considerably.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zahra. I mean, what you are reminding us there is that we cannot just take a section of the society. We need to look at the society as a whole, and that really is necessary to move on in a post-COVID era. I'm now going to present to you the third speaker, Malcolm Richards. His focus is on white community and the reality of our Black collective success in having to be forced to speak to white people in their spaces. The need to develop critical thinking when speaking to the white people with a focus on the correct system and the cost to us as Black people and to our children in the system, and on how we walk through this as Black educators in schools. The allyship of this in teachers' education and the need to give our children voice in the system.
My name is Malcolm Richards. I'm a teacher, academic, community educator, and activist. And I'm not based in Bristol. I'm actually further in the deep, deep, deep south of England, in the middle of Devon. There are a few things that I wanted to speak about today, but Sister Betty and Zahra have already touched upon them. And so I want to talk about really about the reality for many educators in that we are having, especially at this time, conversations and critical conversations about our positionality, our identity, our ways of thinking, our ways of being, our ways of doing, our ways of enacting in predominantly white spaces. I mean that in terms of white spaces, as in they, in many cases, your classes, your leadership teams are predominantly people who are racialized as white. But if we think about the institutions of education, then we also have to recognize that they are white spaces. And if we can't disconnect that, and that talks to things of white supremacy and lots of the discourse that you're hearing now. So we have to understand where we want. A few people wrote in the comments around the hostile environment, and the term hostile environment is almost a recent addition to our lexicon to describe the situation that we're in. Some would describe it as Babylon. Some would describe it as oppression. We can call it a hostile environment because that's a nicer way of really describing the trauma, the violence that for generations people of color have experienced within our education system, which goes beyond Bernard Cord's work in 1971, goes to the very heart of legislation in this country around race. If we think of Notting Hill, the arrival of our Windrush generation, and so on and so forth. So we have to understand that hostile environment is a system of oppression, which is bound up in structural and institutional racism. Just saying those words can result in the institution and people in the institution inflicting trauma and violence upon you as an educator. That is our truth. If you are a person of color who accesses or enters an education space, and a formal education space in the United Kingdom, our lived experience, our stories, our counter stories speak to that truth. The things that we're hearing around the Black Lives Matter discourse and COVID are not things that we have just discovered. Sister Betty spoke of some of the resources that are being promoted and been highlighted, and she's been one of many people who have promoted those. But this isn't new information. This information has always been within our communities, has always been a part of our communities. We have always educated our children with this knowledge, whether that is through a variety of different spaces, our supplementary school system, our spiritual and religious belief spaces, and so on and so forth. Our barbershops and hairdressers, which a lot of people are missing now because those spaces are not available. And we have to continually evolve and find new spaces to speak about our truths. So I've spoken about the risk of that hostile environment, but I think it's also important to begin to think about the gifts of knowledge that we are collectively as educators providing at the moment. So in our individual practice, as Sister Betty has alluded to and Zahra has alluded to, we in our individual practice strive to ensure that we are trying to, and I'm going to use bunny ears, decolonize the curriculum in our teaching. If we haven't been doing that, then we've started on the journey to consider how we do that. And that speaks to Zahra's points around positionality. Where is it I am coming from? I want to kind of pose 3 provocations, and then I'm going to stop because I could talk for a long time on this. As an academic, as somebody who is connected to the educator community, now presently, but also through previous generations of family who have been educators, I acknowledge that there is privilege in the work that we do. There's absolute danger, but there is privilege in that. But as Black educators, I think there are 3 things that we have to always consider. One is that we're constantly seeking to transform hostile environments. Just by the fact that we went through our various qualifications to try and become an educator, in whichever way, shape or form of that, within this system, usually implies that we're trying to do something transformative. But that, and we recognize that because we have the battle scars and the stories to share that. The second part of that is that we have to, as educators, be connected to the histories that we claim to represent, or the system demands that we represent. I'm sure many people on this call have been bombarded with requests to help their school, their institution, their colleagues, their family decolonize their thinking, because that's what's been happening. I personally have been, I'm going to say, bombarded by white people asking me to help them on this journey. That requires me to be connected to my history. Otherwise, I am talking mess. And we, as Black educators, can't be in a position now where we're talking mess. We have to be connected to the histories that we, just by being in the space, represent. And the third thing I want to say is, by trying to transform hostile environments, by being part of connected to our histories, we have to focus then on building communities. Now, this is a really important distinction when I say this. As teachers, we know that we're building our school community and we're developing all young people who are in our care. And that's a vital part of our work. We may live in a community where we do charitable activities. Are we building our cultural communities? Are we building our home communities? Because if we're not doing those things, then that's a disconnect from the histories that I've referred to before and the practices that we've had for generations, which have always sought to transform hostile environments. Now, I've tried to truncate that thinking in a really short space of time. I guess the challenge I'd like to pose to all of us is that we have to consider those 3 points in our work. Our work is not our day-to-day job that we get paid for, because as Black educators, we know that our work completely transcends the tiny school spaces. Our work happens in supplementary school spaces. Our work happens with our children. Our work happens in our activism. Our work happens when we walk around the shops to go and do shopping at a socially distance and are being followed by security guards and have to deal with that. That is our work. It isn't a job. It is our lived experience. But we have to connect that lived experience to those 3 points: building communities, transforming those hostile environments, and recognizing our history so that we are able then to transform the spaces and the thinking of people we engage in the classrooms that we are blessed and honored to be in front of. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Malcolm. I mean, what you are reminding us there really is the work of all of us. That is, we are not just an individual. We work in a community, and that community needs to be affected by the way that we live our lives, because we need to be people that are going there to change things. I'm now going to present to you our fourth speaker, Saroj. Our focus is on adverse childhood experiences. She will give a quick introduction to what they are and that we should bear them in mind when working with children and young people, and also on the setting up of an education base for children who could not attend mainstream school due to their medical needs. The lesson we can take from the latter and share some thoughts on what schools should be focused on after COVID-19.
So post-COVID education, I believe that the most important mission for schools is to teach children how to think for themselves and to foster lifelong learning. I'm going to speak about something that impacts on their brain, because the brain will have been impaired by adversity and trauma, as we've spoken about. Children will have been away from secure attachment figures, be it a class teacher or be it a grandparent during this time. I'll also speak a little bit about Castle Education Centre, which was a centre that I set up for children that had medical needs. It was along the lines of a PRU in some ways, Zahra. I've worked in PRUs as well, just to say that, just to share that with you. I think as we consider new curriculums, it's important to bear in mind adverse conditions. And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was the first person that made me think about them. She's an American educator. Well, not really, she's not educator, she's actually a physician, but she does have a wellness foundation as well. And she describes ACEs as traumatic or stressful events that occur in childhood that could potentially have negative impact across the life course in the absence of resilience and supportive relationships. So the ACEs they used in the first study with these, the ones along abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. But I think we can add to these, we can add prejudice, pandemic, poverty, hunger. So these are new things that, not new things, but things we know that children are facing today. Another person that I've been listening to is Dr. Gabor Mate, who worked with people who had addictions, and along the lines he saw that people had suffered these difficulties in their younger life. So he says for healthy brain development, it's essential to have the following: non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, and consistently attuned parenting or caregivers. So that includes us, because we are that kind of person for the children a lot of the time as well. We've seen that mental health has been impacted, as we've said already. This impairs children's ability to think and learn. Poorer families have been impacted more. This is on top of existing inequalities, such as the increase in the attainment gap between poorer and richer children, which increases to 18 months by the age of 16. To learn more about ACEs, you can look on Public Health England. There's a free course, and also it's worth listening to this chappie, Nicky Murray from Burnside Primary, who talks at a Scottish conference about how he transformed their school using well-being as a central focus. So that he did, and the children, it was a very deprived area that he talks about. He used lots of different research to support that, and he talked to the parents, he involved the parents along the way, which I thought was really important. Okay, so my call to action is that we create schools which offer not just a safety net, but a place where children can learn about trauma and also be supported to use the resilience factors that they've got around them. We've got, someone mentioned recovery curriculum, and that's going to be something that I think we need to look at. So these are things that we need to consider. There are lots of resiliences around that children can draw on. So taking a trauma-informed approach, our special school opened a new base for children with medical needs. All of those with medical needs had anxiety, depression, ASD children, neurodiverse, and a lot of them struggled with coming into school. They had mostly home tuition at this point, but the purpose of the base was to increase their hours, to offer them a broader curriculum as well. So my purpose, because teachers always have their own agenda, right, was to go along the lines of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and to create a base that they could, somewhere they could call school, to give them a sense of belonging that they didn't have, as something that would introduce some normality into their lives as well. So we offered them a variety of things that you can see there on the screen. Also, teachers had training in lots of things. As things were required, we put in that training that they needed. And so it was about doing those things for them. As somebody's mentioned already, I think Zahra mentioned about relationships. That's really, really key, to have good relationships. To those trusting relationships allowed us to sort of readdress some of the inequalities. It allowed us to meet them at their point of need. We got to know them as individuals. So those children that were nervous could bring in their parent, or they could remain on site. Their tutor could come in onto site. They could have part-time timetables. We then integrated them into small teaching groups. There was flexibility to work one-to-one. And as their input increased for them, the little successes increased for them, they accessed more and more, which was good. We created a culture there, really, that was based on my strong belief that people create a place and that relationships are key. With reference to children, teacher training, so they don't know what children bring into the classroom. That's one thing as a teacher, we have to start to learn about the children and know what the experiences have been for those children. We don't necessarily know what they are. The smallest thing can trigger something. We don't even know what it is half the time. So until we see what it is, then we can't really teach that child properly. So the teacher trainers, people are doing the training, should teach about early childhood trauma, because it affects both behaviour and also learning. So a behaviour that a teacher might find troublesome might just be a child's response to trauma or toxic stress. A good teacher, I think we've said this along the way, is a resilience factor, especially if it's someone they can identify with. So identity is key. Just by you being there improves their life chances. Research shows that when Black children are taught by a Black teacher, it increases their likelihood of participating in education for longer. So what were some of the successes at my base at Castle? The children recognised what was on offer. They came in, there was their access to increased hours. There was more control of their well-being. The parents seemed to be less stressed. They supported one another as well, which was a nice thing to see. Children were able to transfer to more permanent placements. We weren't a permanent place. We were just there for children for a short period of time to try and help them manage. We supported into post-16 too. One young lady really stands out for me. She said that the high that she got from the weekly boxing workout was preferable to the release from self-harming. So these are, I think, issues that young people face regularly. We don't always know that they're self-harming, but when they come to light, we need to know how we can support them. Okay, so I don't think that education is a panacea to racism. As Malcolm said, we work outside of school, we work in all kinds of spaces. I do believe that it does help to create society which is free from racial abuse. It's part of the work that we have to do. But we should never have to say that our lives have value and should be protected. So what we take from this is what Gloria Tam and Diana Azar say, that it's important to build resilience. They also go on to say that this opportunity now is for us time to reflect and to look at what do children really need, what skills do they need in an unpredictable world, such as informed decision making or creative problem solving, and perhaps above all, adaptability. So as I've said, we should never need to say that our lives have value and deserve protection. This is the time to review what's on offer. We need to look at reclaiming identity, creating a new culture of respect, and a curriculum that produces children that are self-aware, emotionally intelligent people. And one of the things is to support the recovery from trauma will be neuroplasticity. That's the ability of the brain to change and recover and reprogram. The younger the child, the more likely it is that they're affected by trauma, but also the easier it can be to help them recover as well. So I'll leave you with a quote from Coronation Street, spoken by a black son to his black father, which I quite liked. And that was, "If you don't act now, you're just leaving the fight for someone else." Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sister Soroj. And what you are telling us there is that we need to know the children that we are catering for. And by knowing them, then we'll be able to meet their needs more. I'm presenting to you our fifth speaker, Dalian Adolfo. His focus is on the role of culture in education and its importance for raising attainment amongst learners. The absence of non-white cultural contributions to history in the UK curriculum is therefore a contributing factor to low outcomes for Black students. It is essential then to explore ways and means of making the curriculum more diverse so Black children can also receive the positive reinforcement they need to be motivated to do more.
Thank you, Sam. Really appreciate you having me on board this panel to share what I guess relevant experience I can bring to the table. My name is Dalian Adolfo, and I'm an educationist primarily, and I work in many mediums. So no longer a frontline teacher, but I use video, obviously written literature, and a range of other media to basically teach about aspects of African cultural traditions and practices. I run an educational initiative called Ancestral Voices, which I set up with my wife. And the reason why we set these up, because she has a video production background and I obviously come from education. So we merged our skills to create these range of resources because we could tell that this isn't something we could do from within the institution. So we put our skills together, knowing my background, we formulated the learning resources in a way that it will fit into the institutionalized system. And this is what we've been doing for the last 10 years. I really like the fact too that Sam started off his presentation with that video that you saw, where you saw this image of a white angel who's standing on the neck of a Black devil. And this is one of the things that we need to really understand, in the sense that racism, it didn't start from a social space. It started in the religious imagination of Europeans. Yeah. So there's often much about our own indigenous traditions that makes us uncomfortable, because we haven't taken the time to really research these things. So on many levels, many Black, and I mean it politically in this way, Black people actually perpetuate their own anti-Blackness. Yes. And as that statue, for me personally, it says it all. The other thing that we also need to understand, I think, that we need to focus on is education isn't just a system of gathering data or information, but it's also a way of consolidating power, yes? And also maintaining and pushing forth your own agenda in that regard. Because when we start looking at it in this manner, we'll start to see where most of our exclusion comes from. I'm going to share my screen now to show one of the things that stuck with me during my teacher training in 2007, when I went to the Institute of Education to retrain, because I used to teach at FE, and then I retrained to teach at secondary. And it's the qualified teacher standards, yes, which was then one of the checklists you had to kind of go through when you finished your PGCE. I believe now it's no longer there, because I think Cameron abolished it. So again, we have the understanding of politics influencing education, which is why I've said the point. Let's ensure that we are understanding education as a system of consolidating power. Power for some, while others get disempowered. So if you look at the qualified teacher standards, one of the clauses, Q18, it says, understand how children and young people develop, and that the progress and well-being of learners are affected by a range of developmental, social, religious, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic influences. So once we have this clause already given to us by the Department of Education, the fact that we do not have enough cultural resources at our disposal is already an act of discrimination. Yes, and the people who this is affecting the most is our young people, because they go into this space and they're invisible. All they see is data or information that makes them think everything they're learning came from a European space. Their ancestors contributed absolutely nothing. So this is very dangerous. The curriculum in itself fosters that kind of thinking. You know, it doesn't have to be explicit, but it's there. So when I got invited to this panel discussion, the other thing that happened, which I really liked, was the fact that I got to speak to an older colleague of mine, a lady by the name of Beverly Hillman. And she actually, our discussion gave me a lot of information to share here, because what she mentioned was that in 1990, when they first introduced the national curriculum, the government at the time actually introduced a scheme called ILEA, whose focus was to make the curriculum more multicultural. And then what happens? Margaret Thatcher came and got rid of all of that. So you see, what we can see when we look at the history is our cultural, should we say, relevance becomes a political football. Yeah, and everybody kicks it when they feel they have a need for it, and then they take it out. But what all this keeps happening or doing is our young people are still getting disempowered. So now that we've come back to this space, because it's like revolving doors with the history now. Yeah, we go and then we come back. If we're going to have these discussions about how to move forward, one of the key things we need to also add to that discussion is to protect these cultural, should we say, resources from political interference. Otherwise, all we're going to do is go through cycles. We go and then we come back and then we arrive again, because people have been here before. So let's also invite those older teachers, because their experiences will be useful. We can learn from not necessarily even their mistakes, but how they were subverted by the political system. Yeah? So those are my two takeaways. We need to go back and look at education as a system of power and how it disempowers others. And the next point, which Malcolm talked about when he said that people are coming to him we as Black educators also need to know the totality of our cultural experience. It's not enough that we can choose which bits we think is possible or is frightening or demonizing. You're either your whole culture or you're not. So that's all I have to add. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brother Delian. I mean, what you are saying there is that we do not need to stop with what what we've been doing, but we need to think about what we are doing, because sometimes we do not think. We just do what either the head of department are saying to us, or the head teachers are so asking us to use languages that will be detrimental to us. And they're asking us to teach things that will remove those things that we've contributed into. Our last speaker, who is not the least, is Muna Abdi. Our focus is on the danger of false allyship. There is the need for moving away from passive allyship to active solidarity, and what this will actually look like in the school space. The language in an anti-racist work.
Thank you so much, Sam, and just thank you to all of the panelists that have spoken so far. It's just been really incredible and insightful to listen to take in, to learn from. I'm always learning in these spaces. My name is Dr. Muna Abdi. I'm an education and racial equity consultant based in Sheffield. A lot of the work that I do is working with educators, but particularly with school leaders around anti-racist practice and how to embed anti-racist work within their school settings. What I often find is, given the nature of the fact that most of our educators in the country are white, and particularly in senior leadership positions, I often find myself talking about anti-racism to an all-white audience. And so the conversation inevitably ends up falling on a conversation around active allyship and what active allyship looks like, and the need to unpack whiteness on an individual level before you can even look at whiteness on a systematic level. And so, because I often talk to white people, I always start with the first statement, which is racism is not a Black problem. But more often than not, it is people of colour who carry the burden of both enduring these systems of oppression and also trying to educate those who actively benefit from these systems. Anti-racism work cannot and should not be the sole responsibility of people of colour. This requires active allyship to work in solidarity with us and to carry this burden of responsibility. Allyship, I know, is a term that is used far too often now, but what active allyship is a lifelong process and a commitment to building relationships that are based on trust, consistency, and accountability. It is not self-defined work, and efforts must be recognised by those that you are trying to seek to be an ally with. Just as anti-racism is a verb, allyship is too. It is dependent not on who we are, but on what we choose to do in every space and in every interaction. Someone who is committed to doing anti-racist work cannot guarantee that they will always make anti-racist choices in the spaces and interactions that they find themselves in. This work is a human endeavour. We all fall, we make mistakes, and there are times where we may find ourselves complicit in systems that oppress others. This is why this work requires a willingness to own our mistakes, to decenter ourselves, and to resolve to take action, to change our action. This work is never complete, and so as we learn more, we always need to think about what we can do better. It is always reliant on the action. As a white ally, you must also be an anti-racist. The responsibility you have is to not only unpack your own whiteness and your own privilege in order to dismantle a system that is designed to give you advantage and benefit, but to also actively support and co-conspire with those that these systems work against. One of the most common mistakes white allies make, and some of you in this room may have made this mistake, is that you fall back into the habit of centering a privileged perspective. An example of this may be a person of colour sharing an experience of racism in the workplace with you that you, as an ally, through your lived experience, cannot recognise. If as an ally, you seek to use motivated reasoning in order to offer other ways of interpreting that encounter, perhaps saying statements like, "I'm sure he didn't mean it like this. Did you hear it correctly? Perhaps this is what was meant." These are often well-meaning statements, but what they result in is the gaslighting of a person of color, invalidating their experiences and centering a privileged perspective. Please take a moment to think about whether you have found yourself doing this to a colleague, or perhaps even a student. Without a constant awareness of the traits of white fragility and how it manifests, these habits will continue to re-emerge in our school spaces. The key to doing meaningful anti-racist and allyship work is to constantly be in a state of learning, to expect discomfort, to listen, to listen, to listen, to reflect, and to act. There is no allyship without action. So I'm just going to finish off with some tips. And I share this because very often in the training that I offer, it is not just about discussing the theory of race and racism, but it's about thinking about how we can change theory into practice. And so these are just some tips and suggestions to take away. Consider joining an anti-racist reading group that consists of both people of color and white people. I can't emphasize how important these spaces are, and also to say that they have a set of principles that they need in order to work well, and power dynamics do work in those spaces too, but it is invaluable if you want to be a meaningful ally. Do not invite yourself into people of color only spaces. It's a sign of white privilege to feel entitled to be in any and all spaces. Unless you are invited into spaces or it's a space designed to bring people together, do not think that you have the authority to be in that space. Do the work. Try not to request reading lists, resources, or guidance from people of color through social media or through email and expect this work for free. This is labor. It takes time and it takes energy. Reflect on how this is a practice of entitlement and privilege, and please think before you send that message. Actively listen when people share their experiences with you and fight the urge to offer solutions or unwarranted help. Think about the white savior complex and how this manifests. Don't wait for the right time to act. It is a privilege to make this choice, a privilege that people of color do not have. Time and a need to perform allyship will always be apparent to you. It's not something that is manufactured. In those moments, you will always have to make a choice, whether you feel ready or not. And finally, work through and with your discomfort. No matter what, continue to show up. Remember that to the people that you have committed to, it is about trust, consistency, and accountability. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Now, we find that what we are saying here is not just a matter of you going to do it alone. You need to do it with other people. And those other people, you need to be able to be accountable, because sometimes we just do things thinking that, oh, I've done it. But we need to be able to check what we've done. Is it working? Is it not working? If it's not working, what is it that is making it not to work? Have you done the things that you can do as the best thing? Because that's really the question. Do your best, but do it in such a way that if anybody asks you a question, you'll be able to answer that question. Thank you to all our presenters and the NEU team, Equality Department, BEA, LBEN, BENEU, and all participants for participating in this event. Look forward to meeting everyone that wants to be involved to plan, document, deliver, assess, and the new curriculum. Thank you.